Global stocks plummet and peak, and financial markets fluctuate daily. Children, as we all know, are the country's future. But where do they fall in the economic situation? Last week in Colombo, UNICEF organized a panel discussion titled "From Cognitive to Business Capital, Why Investing in Children Makes Better Business Sense" to bring the matter to the forefront. A host of business personalities from some of the vital blue-chip companies were present to join this discourse.
It's young people transitioning without the skills that you need. And what will happen in the next that window, where countries has taken 100 years, 50 years, that data is also showing that you have 20 years, 25 years of that window that will allow your population then to transition to aged population. And so your social capital and investments in young people are very important for that next generation to come. And I think business are here to progress. And we're all here to make business. And investing in these 6 million people that are out there, I think, is the day. And investing in the right things. Of course, we are investing, but maybe not investing at the right times where your capital is well invested. Studies has also shown if you invest $1 in these early interventions, and that means nutrition, breastfeeding, stimulation, you have $17 in return.
Hello there, very good evening to you. You're watching Biz1st in Focus. Well, today on the program we've got the representative of UNICEF in Sri Lanka, Tim Sutton. Well, just to give a recap of what UNICEF has been doing in the country, UNICEF has been a pioneering humanitarian agent for years, for decades, so to speak. They were founded after the World War to help the children who were affected by the World War. And ever since, it has been working towards uplifting the betterment of the children. And also, it has, in Sri Lanka in particular, UNICEF was very, very active during the tsunami disaster. When tsunami struck, it was UNICEF which took the forefront. Well, today, UNICEF is branching into a new direction to help businesses understand the importance of children. And in fact, UNICEF itself organized a forum last week where it spoke about how cognitive capital can help businesses, can uplift businesses, under the title "From Cognitive Capital to Business Capital, Why Investing in Children Makes Better Business Sense." Well, thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Sutton.
Thank you for introducing UNICEF so nicely.
My pleasure. Well, like I said earlier, UNICEF has been very active in the field of humanitarian work. But just tell us about how much of a bigger role has UNICEF been playing in the country, in Sri Lanka, and what has the focus been so far?
So you're right. UNICEF started as an emergency organisation in the wake of the Second World War. We started working in Sri Lanka nearly 50 years ago, and we've been working on uplifting children, as you say, working on very basic things, improving child health, helping the government introduce an immunisation program to immunise every child, helping develop better schools, helping to get every child into school. And more lately we've been focusing on the newer issues that emerge as a country develops further. In least developed countries, we focus on the basics: health, education, water, sanitation. But as we move into working in a more developed country, as Sri Lanka has developed over the years, we're now looking at issues of child protection, protecting children against violence. Right. And at the same time, science is traveling very quickly as well, and we're finding out all new things about how children develop. Right. And one of those things is we're really understanding how the brain develops. And this is the whole idea about cognitive capital, that we now know what inhibits brain development in young children. And so as a development organisation, we're very focused on making sure that countries like Sri Lanka and societies do everything they can to make sure that brain development is maximised for children. Okay. And so this if I go on, it really happens in the first 1,000 days of life, from conception through to the first 3 years. That is the time when the brain grows the most. There are millions of neuron brain connections happening every second.
Right.
And we also know that that development can be stunted or can be depressed by things like poor nutrition, lack of stimulation, witnessing or being exposed to or experiencing violence, abuse or neglect. All of these things can limit the development of the brain in the first 3 years. And what's really important about this is those deficits that develop can never be made up.
So one of the biggest concerns there was, even in the forum, we saw many people bring out the fact that Sri Lanka is known as that country where huge numbers of women go to the Middle East, leaving their children unattended for. But the biggest concern there is that, like you said, it's the first 1,000 days, it's important. How can a country that is developing really strike that balance between helping women get into the job market and at the same time providing for the children and even providing for the future generation?
I think every parent wants to do the best thing for their child. That's the premise. We see in our children the next generation, our future. Everyone wants to do the best thing for their child. But unfortunately, people who are living in poverty or in stressed environments, they need to be able to earn income and find resources. And so their choices are limited. And I think in the forum that we had, it was very clear, everyone agreed that we need to be making sure that we are encouraging women's participation in the labour force, and that requires a whole lot of work to be done, including making sure that childcare can be provided more easily, that industry is available, employment is available in rural communities, which are the source communities for much of this labour. It's a complicated issue, but we have to deal with it.
Well, Tim, the biggest question there was, even the concern there was, even in the forum, was that there were large numbers of women leaving the job market and looking for jobs outside of the country, especially the Middle East, leaving their children unattended for. How can you make this known? As in, like, how can businesses really create that awareness among the job market, even in the labor force, that there are jobs for women in the country that pay well? Because it seems like it's a big responsibility that lies even with the government, private sectors and NGOs to really bring that aspect.
Yeah, and I think you're right. There needs to be a lot of effort focused on this by a range of partners, government, civil society, NGOs, industry. But we need to start from the basic premise that every mother, every father wants to do the best thing for their child. And often many women come to the decision that the best thing that they can do for their family is to be able to provide income for that family. And that's a choice that they make. What we really need to do to make that choice less extreme, and that they have to go somewhere else a long way away from their family to earn that income, is to help their participation in the local labour market. So that's about bringing industry to rural areas, making job opportunities available. There's a whole lot of work that needs to be done. There's legislative changes that need to be made. Childcare needs to be more affordable and accessible for working women. There's all sorts of things that need to be done. But it's a tragedy when a mother feels that she does need to travel overseas and leave her child behind. And the government has already put in place the registration process so that a mother that has a child that's under 5 years of age isn't allowed to go. But that's not the whole answer, and that has unintended consequences as well. And that
Well, UNICEF has been assuming many roles over the past: advocacy, intermediary, and even help, like an agent itself. But has UNICEF Sri Lanka been in conversation with governments, government institutions, to help this whole aspect to emerge?
We are. I mean, UNICEF is a government-to-government organisation. So our main partner is government. Our programs are with government. And we work on this at a number of different areas. The children that are left behind are the most vulnerable in those communities because they're generally from very poor and poverty-stricken households, and they don't have the parental support that would be ideal. So, but it's also important that when we're approaching this issue, that we don't also further stigmatise those families by having programs that single them out and label them as left behind children. So we really focus our programs and our work with government on those areas of greatest deprivation, where the poorest of the poor are, and so we are working on it from that light. But this is why we're actively seeking partners and partnership around this, and the private sector business has so much to contribute to this, not only in the provision of employment opportunities for women and those sorts of things, but in really helping us all think through this issue in new and different ways. As one of the panelists said, you know, what the private industry or business can bring to this is a focus on outcomes rather than process. And when you start to think about these things in a different way, you can come up with new and innovative and novel solutions. And I think that's what we're really trying to stimulate, is bringing these partners together so that we can look at these somewhat old and somewhat stale problems that are entrenched, but try and come up with new and innovative solutions with new partners to really tackle them.
Well, education is the focal point of growth in children, and it's important that we invest in education, and governments need to do that. But the problem there is, when it comes to Sri Lankan education system itself, is that they're not given the right education. Children are given things that they don't really need to use when they come out of school. But how has UNICEF helped governments make decisions, right decisions, when it comes to formulating an education system?
You're absolutely right. Education is key to all of this. And you're right as well in that perhaps the education system in Sri Lanka isn't adjusting as quickly as industry and others and parents and children would like to adjust to the new world. Someone said we're in the fourth industrial revolution. So jobs that are around today in 15, 20 years, when our children who are now being born and growing up are in the workforce, those jobs that we take for granted may not be there. So clearly the acquisition of knowledge, the rote learning is probably not so useful for children anymore. I think that's obvious for everyone, and particularly for parents who are thinking about where their children are going to be in the workforce. But we really do need to help the government, and again, bringing partnerships to bear on this, to really think through what education should be. It's about developing inquiring minds, about problem-solving skills, about being adaptable, about how to relate in groups more effectively. All those skills need to be fostered within the education system. Education, the curriculum, is a very precious thing for a country, and it's guarded closely. It is how a nation teaches its culture, if you like, and what's important as a country. So we don't come in and tell anyone how to do anything. But I think what we're trying to do is stimulate a discussion about what Sri Lanka needs in its young people, who are going to be the people that are driving this economy in this country in 15, 20 years' time.
How can private sectors really affect that change when it comes to education, as in opening up funds and giving scholarships for children, and even teaching what sort of skills that need to...
Yeah, and opening up, vocational skills and all those sorts of things. Private sector can do a whole lot. But what I think we're really looking for as we talk through and develop this partnership with private sector is how we can open up the communication channel so that private sector can, along with us and others, talk to the government about what skills and competencies they need to drive industry, business, Sri Lanka forward. The government is a huge employer of people in Sri Lanka, but for Sri Lanka to grow and to become an upper middle income or even high income country in the next 15 or 20 years, there has to be that change in the skills and competencies that our young people have as they move into what is going to be a very different workforce.
But there is also this aspect of danger when it comes to development. Like you said, you've worked in a couple of countries, including China. Something that you brought up in one of the articles is that even though China was growing faster than ever, there's this ugly truth to it, that the western parts of China was suffering abject poverty, and children were being victimized by it. Sweatshops, and you see child labor. There's a neglected part of China as well, and that comes with development. So there's danger with development. And how can a country like Sri Lanka really bring that aspect and say, okay, we need to protect our children, at the same time we need to go in the direction of development?
And I don't think there's danger in development. I think these things can all be done, and I think China is a great example of this. Yes, the development in the East has been much faster than in the West, but if you look at what China is trying to do now with its high-tech, fast-track rail systems and motorways and developing airports, they're really driving industry west. And we have left behind children in Sri Lanka. In China, 60-odd million left behind children. And that's an internal migration. And so they're very consciously trying to build industry in the West so that parents don't need to travel. And that's the same sort of principle that we were talking about at the forum, is that we need to develop those income-earning capacities closer to where people are. So, yeah, there is no danger in development. There is danger in not developing. And for Sri Lanka to move forward rapidly, as is Sri Lanka's ambition, we really have to start talking about how we can change the dynamics of how we are investing in our children and what outcomes we are expecting from those services that are supporting our children.
Well, with that, let's head into a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll have more on Biz1st in Focus. Come back, you are watching Biz1st in Focus, and we are in conversation with the resident representative of Sri Lanka, UNICEF, Tim Sutton. Thank you very much for joining us again. Well, there's this opposition in Sri Lanka that you see against this whole phrase of spare the rod and spoil the child, that is very, very famous in the Western countries. Culturally, we're so tethered to this idea of really punishing your child when something negative is done, something bad is done. But bad behavior is punished with a rod, and that's how it's done. But excessive amount of usage of it itself will say it's corporal punishment, and it's not good. But how exactly will this affect a child's growth?
Dramatically is how. Violence, toxic stress, even witnessing violence, releases a chemical in the brain that actually depresses brain development. In those times when the brain is developing very rapidly, in those first 1,000 days of life, and again during adolescence, this can have this chemical reaction in the brain after seeing or witnessing or being exposed to or experiencing violence, abuse or neglect, stops brain development. And the impact of that can never be made up. So in those first 1,000 days, it can do witnessing violence, abuse, neglect, or experiencing that, combined with poor nutrition, lack of stimulation, can depress brain development by 20%. And that can never be made up. So that's 20% of the potential of our young people taken away.
So how do you discourage bad behavior among children?
There are many, many ways of positive disciplining. And in many countries around the world, the act of physical violence against a child is against the law, and you will be prosecuted. The good news for Sri Lanka is that norms, these social norms, this acceptance, it does change. It will change over time. And we need to do all that we can to make sure that that change happens as quickly as possible. Because for Sri Lanka, we're in this time of opportunity now. We have the next 15 to 20 years to really maximize this country's development. We have a peace dividend, we have reasonably strong economic growth, we have the demographic transition happening so that we still have a young population that can drive economic growth. And if we really want to move forward more quickly as a country, we must maximize the potential of the young people who will be running this country in 15 to 20 years' time.
But how are the numbers looking like when it comes to child abuse in Sri Lanka?
We don't have solid evidence. We don't have a nationwide survey which gives us definitive figures. And it's very hard data to gather. We do know we have lots of small surveys, we have lots of anecdotal evidence, and many, many people in Sri Lanka understand how prevalent violence is in this society. I think we need evidence to move things forward, but we also need to take a moral stand on this. We know it's wrong. We know there are alternatives, and we need to help families change.
Well, Mr. Sutton, before we wrap up, just a quick question of how businesses, private sectors, non-governmental organizations, schools, public, citizenry itself can come together in order to help the most vulnerable parts of society, and especially the children who experience abject poverty and all the other consequences of development itself.
First of all, Sri Lanka is doing a fantastic job. This country is way ahead of its neighbouring countries in South Asia in terms of nearly all the social development indicators. But that creates another opportunity. Development is a continuous process. So once we take off some challenges, more come along. And the challenges that we're facing now are really around child poverty, addressing child poverty, maximising development in those first 1,000 days of life, adolescent development, and where private sector in particular can really help with this is by working together with organisations like us and the government to really come up with innovative solutions to help rethink the way systems deliver for children and their families. As one of the participants in the panel said, you know, we in the private sector, we think about outcomes, what we're going to do, rather than process. And that's what we need, that's the kind of thinking that we need to be bringing to bear alongside government to really make sure that the many good things that we're doing are made much, much better and deliver better results for our children and our future.
Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Sutton. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Biz1st in Focus, and next week we'll have a new guest with new insights and perspectives. This is Biz1st in Focus, so stay tuned.